Good afternoon. My name's William Malik. I'm the Vice President for Infrastructure Strategies with Trend Micro. And we're going to be talking about digital transformation, particularly as it applies to government. So in the course of this talk, we're going to look at what digital transformation is. We'll look at some key elements for making the platform useful and effective. And we'll take a look at some of the drivers and consequences for building and sustaining an effective team once you have put a digital platform in place. So let's begin by taking a look at our agenda. We're going to define digital transformation, which has a long history. It's basically what computers have been doing in business since the 1950s. We're going to introduce and define the concept of the Identity Workspace. This is the attempt to create a virtual environment that is effective to replace what goes on in the workspace. We'll give some examples about how that works. We'll talk particularly about the problem about building and sustaining teams, and then we'll take a look at some conclusions and next steps. So when we talk about digital transformation, here the idea is not just digitization. That is not just taking existing back office processes and bringing them onto computers. I mean, we've been doing that since 1954. General Electric was the first business to use computers to replace clerks for the purpose of calculating payroll, paychecks, deductions, and such. Instead of using an army of mathematicians, GE decided to buy a computer, program the process, and have that done much more rapidly, efficiently, repeatably, and with higher quality. That was the beginning of the whole trend towards automation. But understand there are two threads leading up to digital transformation. What we just talked about is simply digitization, taking an existing process and porting it mechanically into a set of algorithms. That's important. And we'll talk about how that has happened because it's a prelude to what we're going to be going through. But there's another kind of use of digital transformation where we're going to be creating a digital platform that replaces most of the key functions that would require an in-person interaction. And not just, for the purpose of efficiency, but really to replace what we've lost, especially during this pandemic, in terms of face-to-face interaction, both employee to employee, employee to trainee, and employee to manager or supervisor. So we'll begin by taking a look at the digital transformation of supply chain. We started doing supply chain in the late 1960s in the form of bill of materials processing. The reason this happened was because we were making more and more complex things. Boeing 747 has 1 million parts, and the manual for it has tens of thousands of pages. So two programming constructs helped us manage these processes. The first was the bill of materials, which kept track of those 1 million parts. More complex than simply doing calculations with money, you see, because money is a one-dimensional quantity. It doesn't vary over time, while parts have a history, they have an expected life, they have perhaps a shelf life, they have to be used at a certain time in the process. And people began saying, well, what other information can I get from this base of information about my parts? And they came up with database bill of materials processing so they could ask complex and unplanned questions of that pool of information. Now, that was one of the innovations associated with the 747. The other was the tracking of the manual, and that gave us what's called the simplified markup language, and the whole string from SGML through SML to XML to HTML. That's a separate thread, not part of this talk. But what we're looking at here is what we did with that bill of materials. Once we had the database bill of materials in place, we began being able to use it as an input for sales reporting, and shortly thereafter for sales forecasting. And once we had sales forecasting, that is, once we gone beyond the boundaries of the manufacturing organization into the sales organization, began looking at logistics and how things were moving around. Now we had what was called enterprise resource planning, where you could take a flow of goods throughout the organization, basically tied to this system of managing parts. Well, with that in place, people began saying, is there a way we can extend this? And in the 1980s, um, Walmart and PepsiCo constructed a proprietary link so that when a customer bought a bottle of Pepsi at the local Walmart, Walmart would immediately order a replacement piece. PepsiCo would get the order, send it off, get paid immediately. And the benefits all around were the Walmart never ran out of stuff because the order was placed as soon as the stuff was sold. And you could put forecasting around that and say, looks like the demand for this product is going up. Walmart liked it because they didn't have to keep inventory. And PepsiCo liked it because they were getting paid more quickly for goods shipped in response to demand. Now, one of the secrets of that link that was ever heavily publicized was the fact that it was never profitable. The cost of establishing that communications network was greater than the realized profit by having it in place. Partly that was because it wasn't there very long before the internet took over and business to business commerce over internet, as opposed to over proprietary connections, began to be the name of the game. But we then saw e-commerce, introduction of cloud base for global statistics, and that gave us supply chain management. The big difference between ERP and supply chain management, of course, is that supply chain management brings in third parties. So you track the bauxite ore from the hill in Australia to its manufacturing into aluminum, to its rolling into aluminum foil, to its shipment to a distribution center, to a retail market, to its eventual sale for somebody's use in their cooking. That broader view of supply chain management is still fundamentally digitization. It's with the convergence of IT and OT, led primarily by the promise of 5G and edge computing, that we're moving into the Industry 4.0 realm. And that's where we actually go beyond digitization and start talking about constructing a true digital platform that will allow for the answering of questions that are more complex than can be provided simply by looking at one's particular supply chain. I'm going to give 3 examples of that. The first one is agriculture. Here we have a farmer looking at his field, and alongside that, he has a digital display. This is the digital platform. This display includes information about what parts of the field are dry and need water, what elements of the crop may be suffering from low nutrients and therefore need fertilizer, what parts of the crop may be suffering from some kind of disease and therefore need pesticides, what the weather forecast is, and in the case of time-sensitive products, what the futures market is. Do I harvest the coffee beans today or next week? I can take a look at the futures market and then make an informed decision about when the right time to harvest would be, within the parameters, of course, of when the crop is in fact accessible. Now, the key thing to note here is that the digital platform is the framework that contains this information. The information that's displayed within the digital platform is provided by a multitude of sources. The weather, for instance, may be provided by a national weather service or may be provided by a private contractor, giving weather information of particular use to people in agribusiness. The information about soil fertility may be provided by a manufacturer of fertilizers. The information about symptoms of disease and recommended solutions may be provided by a manufacturer of pesticides. And the information about what the market requires may be provided by a futures market source. So the farmer has at his disposal a dashboard richly populated with information that helps him optimize the growth and harvest of that crop. This is a form of digital platform. Let me show you an additional one. Here in a manufacturing environment, we have a technician that's doing work on a piece of equipment. The technician has not only the physical device in front of him, but the augmented reality of the digital platform tells him what symptoms to look for that indicate a possible failure provided by the manufacturer. It might give him access to education and training materials if he needs to brush up on what to do in this particular circumstance, provided by perhaps an education group or provided by the manufacturer themselves as part of the training of employees. They might have information about what the approved buy list is for various technologies and might have information about what other areas to explore if a particular configuration of problems shows up. So, like the agricultural example we just saw, we have sources from many different areas converging to populate this digital platform. But here there are two additional ones that I want to point out. The first is that if this individual is training somebody else, they may also have access to this same screen or set of screens, but without having operational control over what actions are taken on that. So that's how you bring an apprentice up to speed. And the second thing is that the supervisor, the manager, would also have access to this, not for the purpose of micromanaging, not for the purpose of surveillance, but very particularly to gather metrics about those actions that most bear on the efficiency and the productivity and ultimately the effectiveness of the task with which this maintenance person is chartered. So you have a digital platform that not only makes the employee more productive, but supports training and gives the manager the information he or she needs to be more effective in building the goal of the business. But when we talk about digital platforms, besides agriculture and maintenance, we really need to go to the forefront, the leading edge. The most sophisticated digital platforms out there, of course, are games. Now, my daughter and son in law are both avid gamers, and the kinds of things that happen in games much more sophisticated than what you're familiar with, probably, if you haven't seen them for a few years. There's a game called Gris, Spanish word for gray. And the purpose of the game is to help a young woman who has lost her ability to sing to recover that. It takes about 4 hours. And in the course of doing this, you help this woman face various challenges, negotiate various puzzles, solve certain conundrums. And eventually, as you succeed, the world regains color, song comes back, plants grow. It's a tremendous catharsis. In fact, it has been used in some cases to help people coping with PTSD. So it's a very rich platform. Even in the more traditional role-playing games where you're, hunting a monster with a group of friends, the enhancements there I learned last week allow me as a player to give something to one of my other hunters. Say they're injured and they need something to regain the strength. And if I have one, I can hold it out in my hand. And when they take it, I can give it to them so they now become more effective. You have the ability in these advanced games to record sequences of events, to discuss strategies, to review past actions, and to come up with plans to solve particular problems based on the terrain, the challenges of the enemy, and so forth. Not just playing the game for personal gratification, but building a community that uses the game to sustain and encourage itself. Uh, these groups meet on a regular basis, and in one case, they're multicultural, global, uh, multilingual, and share information through icons when they don't have a one on one common language. Very rich platform and a great place in which to start considering to build a digital platform. So, what is it that's making this possible? What's driving us to digital transformation? Well, there are a set of abilities that are now becoming abundant. The richness of communications. We now have very high bandwidth to a lot of areas. It's getting better. We're getting more links. We now have near real time data. And I highlight the near real time nature to remind people that in certain situations, latency remains a problem. Um, Take a simple example. Folks expect satellites to help with some 5G environments. Well, one of the goals of 5G is 1 millisecond response time. That's in the REL 18 stuff that's going to come out in about 3 years. Well, 1 millisecond response time kind of knocks satellites out of the picture entirely because an electromagnetic signal goes about 186 miles in a millisecond. And 186 miles is about the lowest possible orbit you could have. So, setting aside the problem of getting from your device to the uplink, then to the satellite and back down, and then from the downlink back to your device, there's 2 milliseconds right there. So you've broken the criteria. Satellites will have a place, but not in this place. In fact, in certain applications, the cloud itself is too far away, and that gives rise to the need to take a piece of the cloud and bring it in close, and that's what we call edge computing. Edge does not replace cloud, it augments cloud. Think of it as a local cache for certain applications, say automotive management in self-driving or augmented driving environment. You're going to have national maps, which will be available in the cloud. But when you want to take a look at local conditions in a particular city at a particular time, you're going to have real-time sensors. You're going to have traffic, vehicle to vehicle to infrastructure. V to X is the broad general term. And that cannot take the time to go to a cloud server and come back. It has to be handled very locally, primarily within an edge server, edge device located within a couple of kilometers of where the action is. And that device would gather real-time information about, upcoming needs of public safety, upcoming maintenance on roads, planned closures, police activity, and so on. And all of that would then be reflected to the cloud. Thinking of the cloud in this model as kind of like a back-end store, but the real decisions about driving will be taking place entirely locally. The third thing that's making digital transformation of the scale I'm talking about possible is the growing awareness of the need for zero trust architecture. Now, first thing I want to say about zero trust is I hate the name because obviously it's not zero trust. If there were zero trust, you wouldn't trust anybody with your credentials. What zero trust actually means is that there is a minimum amount of trust granted to people, and there is an authoritative source to whom you can go to request access to a particular resource in that particular part of the net. So think of zero trust architecture as being what we used to call network access control brought up to the 21st century. The theory here is that you do not by default have the right to anything. You and your device have to be validated and authenticated. If your device is out of date with regard to, say, software updates, or with regard to malware, or with regard to wanting to scan, or if there are indications that your device is generating a lot of what might be spam email, then that device is going to have to get corrected before you're going to allow it to participate. Well, these three things are predicates, things that make it possible. But why are we going to do digital transformation? Well, it's the pandemic. Working from home has forced people to rethink what it means to do their job. Now, there's good news hidden in there. The bad news is that corporate culture is under attack, that traditional management styles are being rendered ineffective. The way you solve that is you explicitly describe what the task that a worker has to do is. You describe it in enough detail that so that you can then do analysis and say, okay, this person has to do this job. What are the inputs they need to perform it? What are the elements of the task to get it done? Where do the outputs go? And by performing that analysis, you have the opportunity to strip away unnecessary or redundant process steps. To give an example from my history, I was at Gartner for 11 years. And we had a fellow there who had been a salesman at Xerox. He had a client who used to print multiple copies of a 160-page report every month. And I said, what can you do to help me with this? And the salesman suggested, well, print it 6 up on 2 sides of a page. And the fellow said, well, show me that. And he showed him a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with 6-page images on each side. So that 160-page report comes down to about a 13.5-page report. And the executive said, well, yeah, you've saved my printing costs, but nobody's ever going to read this. To which the salesman replied, nobody reads it today. I mean, get real. And he says, you're right. They just archive them. So they went to that. Eventually, I think they went to microfiche. But the point is that by doing this analysis, by understanding exactly what you need to do, you can then strip out unnecessary parts. And by understanding exactly what the wider mission is that that process is a part of, you can define the right metrics to effectively deliver on those goals without measuring the wrong stuff, without measuring activity rather than results. And this is a soapbox that I climb on fairly regularly. Frederick W. Taylor, the father of scientific management, said in the early 1920s, if you measure it, you'll manage it. Frederick W. Taylor never said, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And the reason he never said that was because he's a smart fellow, and that's not true. We manage stuff that we can't measure all the time. Do you have children? I have 2 daughters. You do not rely only on measurement. His statement was a warning. When you pick a metric, you are going to be tempted to manage against that metric. So his warning was pick the right metrics. Don't end up putting a metric on everything you can measure and call that a management information system. It's not. It's a data lake filling system. This brings up the whole point of new styles of management. Managers have to figure out how to effectively deal with a team when they can't see them on a regular basis. Because when we resume business as usual, it won't be business as usual. Every indication is that a substantial amount of the workforce is going to be out of the office most of the time. They'll be working remotely, and they will expect to have the same treatment that any other employee gets, whether local or remote. Now, if you're a manager who relies on management by wandering around, you will not have access to 2/3 of your workforce at any point in time, which means either you'll be using an statistically weak sample size, or you'll have to figure out a better set of metrics and know how to sustain that corporate culture without relying on the face-to-face meeting. Now, of course, to support this, we need more infrastructure. We need much richer infrastructure. And there are challenges that are going to come along with this. Obviously, the security of the extended workforce, the expansion of the attack surface that the enterprise faces. And we will get to those in the third part. Now let's take a look at what this identity workspace is, because this is the key to figuring out exactly what it is that we have to rebuild. Since we're all not in the office, we have to rely on something else. And here's a statement from an article in last July's Harvard Business Review. I have a reference to it in the hard copy of this talk. There are spaces where we learn what it means and what it takes to be someone, say a good soldier, a chef, a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, a leader. Through a bundle of stories, practice, feedback, rituals, and relations, we become that someone, ideally, but not always, remaining ourselves in the process. When you strip away the office and all that the office means, we have to figure out what to do to recreate the interpersonal aspects of that environment. And this is why I hearken back to the third example of the digital platform. The ability to build teams and sustain relationships despite geographic differences, despite cultural differences. The problems that the pandemic has forced upon us are resolved by understanding the elements of corporate culture and networking, I mean, person-to-person networking, and the informal communications that organizations depend on to sustain their culture, to communicate their values. This highlights the dependencies the workforce had on the physical office, and your digital platform has to be able to replace those missing dependencies. Here are some of the management dependencies. The stress of change on workers. There was an article recently that talked about it's not depression, Psychologically, depression is anger directed inwards. It's languishing. It's a sense of nothing matters. It's hard to make progress, low energy. And this affects workers and managers. And its impact on organizational behavior is challenging and dramatic. So, what do? We figure out ways to keep people connected. We maintain that sense of participation in the group without being intrusive. This young man at his computer is going to school. That's my grandson, and he's going to school in my son's house. He feels connected to the school because, in addition to the lessons, they have ample opportunities for informal connection, for team efforts, for games, for chat, moderated or unmoderated, but certainly not unsupervised. And this is the fulcrum on which your productivity renaissance can happen. This is the key to making the identity workspace effective in your digital platform for your enterprise. Now, there are technology dependencies as well. We have a vast increase in the amount of traffic on the network. We have a much broader attack surface that enterprises now have to deal with. Um, the home worker is part of the corporate environment. I'm sitting on my computer at home. I'm connected to my business. However, I'm not connected by a VPN because it turns out that's not a great idea all the time. The VPN means that anything that happens on this desk has access to everything at the other end of the VPN. And that violates the principle behind zero trust. I have another talk on zero trust. Perhaps if you want, I can get you a link to it. But the point here is we don't want to have these wide open pipes with no filtering, with no authentication. We need to be prudent about what access we allow workers and their processes to. I'm working at home. I have one network at home. I've got 3 or 4 IoT devices connected to that network. And if one of them gets messed with, then the blowback could hit the traffic between me and my organization. So I don't have a VPN for specific tasks. I have a specific access. I authenticate myself to that. I get the information I need and I disconnect. The cybersecurity for remote workers, again, this is an instance where zero trust architecture usually brought into reality by using what's called SASE, which is Secure Access Service Edge. That's a cloud-based way of doing zero trust architecture. You'll have many vendors who claim they are doing various kinds of SASE with different components. Zero trust architecture itself is a design goal, not something you can buy in a box. The exponential growth curve is to remind us of the impact of Moore's Law. Moore's Law, as you know, states that every year the number of people who believes that Moore's Law is coming to an end doubles. So far, it hasn't happened. Moore's Law has 3 flavors. It has a flavor that applies to processing power, which doubles every roughly 2 years, memory density, which doubles roughly every 12 to 15 months, and network bandwidth, which doubles every 9 or so months. Now, if you spin those out over the course of a decade, something that doubles every 2 years over a decade is going to grow about 100-fold. And we've seen that processing power at unit cost has grown about 100-fold for the past 4 or 5 decades. When you look at storage densities on that same scale, we see that storage densities increased by a factor of about 1,000 across that 10-year horizon, roughly speaking. And that's held true also for the last 3 decades. And when it comes to communication bandwidth, the increase is even steeper there. Over a decade, we see a 10,000-fold increase in communications bandwidth. So being able to provide the network capacity to support this is not a problem for long. And by the way, this gives a lot of strength to the edge computing argument in an environment where computing of the 3 grows slowest. That's the thing you want nearby because you can pump a heck of a lot of data from here to there, but the processing is not going to grow as fast. So what are we doing? We're looking at this for a way to do online team building and training, for a way to have interaction with customers and prospects, citizens, visitors in your realm, and by enriching digital communications going forward. That's another key element, the audiovisual tools, going beyond Teams and Zoom and so on, and getting into something that has a little more substance and that can itself become part of the digital platform. You might have a digital platform zone that has links to presentations that could be of value to your colleagues. And like stepping into a classroom, you'd step into a venue that has many offerings, all of which are available on demand. So, how do we get there? Well, the first thing is to understand that this new environment is bringing a much broader attack surface. Supply chain attacks, the recent hack of the ransomware attack against the pipeline in the eastern seaboard of the US. These remind us that this infrastructure still remains fragile. Um, with regard to that attack, I would simply say the hackers are now apologizing for the fact that they caused so much trouble. Part of that is directed to the US administration, and the footnote there is please don't send a predator drone at us. Part of it is probably also directed to the government of the uh, area where these hackers come from, probably saying, you know, we really didn't mean to cause this much trouble. We're just in it for the money. It's the unfortunate story of somebody who kidnaps a girl and discovers that she's the daughter of the local crime lord. You know, you really don't want to find yourself in that situation. And we have blended threats. The amount of information that's been gathered over the last 10 to 15 years about individuals hasn't been lost, it has been aggregated. So we have threats to individuals that then compromise their device, which then lead to phishing, which then lead to ransomware. So, what do you do to remediate this? Well, multi-layered defense. The zero trust, the network access control is part of it. Don't give up on the platforms. Don't give up on the notion of observing network traffic. By using layered technologies, if one fails, another will step in. By building the concept of trustworthiness, which merges security with awareness of privacy, we can put in place a stable, reliable platform on which to address and solve these problems. When it comes to building and keeping skilled teams, one message I'd say is we have to hire for values, not skills. We want to train and reinforce that culture. We want to reward exceptional performance in both of the dimensions that we're looking at here. This 2x2 matrix represents Jack Welch's thoughts on teams. When I was at IBM, the issue was, is it harder to manage this person than it would be to compete against this person? And if the answer was no, then you would do whatever you could to handle the individual. We've now learned that there are two parts. There's, are they generating the results, and are they living the values? If they're doing both, that's great, keep them. If they're doing neither, well, not much. The problem is the corners. You may have an individual who's really gung-ho, very much into the values, but they're just not generating the results. How do you get them to turn it up a notch? But what's even worse are the individuals who are generating results, but they're causing a lot of trouble. You know there's going to be some sort of equal opportunity or sexual harassment lawsuit if they're not brought under control. These people can be a real danger to the organization. You have to figure out how to move them to a less visible place if you can find one for them in the organization at all. By setting fair metrics in the context of a well-defined process, your people will trust you and they will support you and they will assist in the achievement of corporate goals. If they find that their input is not valued, if they find that misbehavior is not sanctioned but rewarded, then you've just killed the corporate culture, and it's very difficult to come back from that. So what do? I want us to leverage the opportunity for the digital transformation, create that digital platform, incorporate the Identity Workspace. Make sure that you can build that platform for customers, for citizens, for employees to create that rich culture. And that brings to the end of my prepared remarks. I'm now happy to consider any questions you might have. Thank you for your time and attention.